Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be with you tonight. I go back a long way with Harvard. I'll tell you about my first experience. This was 60 years ago, believe it or not. I was 17 years old, graduated from high school, and was able to get a job at Harvard Summer School, which was in Sevier Hall at that time, as the lowliest clerk in the whole system, which meant in those days, before computers, we had to check all the grades verbally. You had teams, and there were two people sitting back and forth. There were 10,000 grades, and they had to be checked at least twice. That was my first experience at Harvard, and it went on for 4 years because I kept the job the whole time I was in college, and I loved it in certain respects, but it did get pretty boring, I tell you. Fortunately, we don't have to do that anymore. 20 years ago, I stood here in this hall and was invited to be a visiting professor for a semester and had a wonderful time here. And I want to show you something that I was given at that time. And this is my mug, which I have carried with me for the last 20 years. And I got all sorts of pats on the back this morning from the students that I had my mug with me for coffee, and that this is the mug that I have taken with me every place I've gone. I had two of them. I have to admit I lost one, but I have held on to this one. So thank you, Harvard, very much. Okay, well, on to the subject at hand. In the 2000 United Nations report on climate change, as you all know, the overall assessment was unequivocal confidence that global warming is underway and 90% certainty that human activities are the cause. However, recent updates of the 2007 report spell out a more daunting scenario, as we all know. The worst-case projections are being realized, leading to an increasing risk for abrupt and irreversible climatic shifts. In other words, the dreaded tipping point is now a possibility. A month from now, the world leaders will gather in Copenhagen to devise an international treaty that surely will be one of the most complicated and difficult that has ever been attempted. The twin of climate change, the economic meltdown, also faces us. These two are the product of the same insatiable desire for more money, more energy. Uncontrolled greed underlies both of these planetary disasters. Thomas Friedman, writing in the New York Times last spring, put it this way. He said, "What if the crisis of 2008 represents something much more fundamental than a deep recession? What if it's telling us that the whole growth model that we created over the last 50 years is simply unsustainable economically and ecologically, and that 2008 was when we hit the wall, when Mother Nature and the market both said, no more? What if we face up to the fact that unlike the U.S. government, Mother Nature doesn't do bailouts?" Rather sobering paragraph. There are many needed responses to such news, but tonight we're going to focus on just one, and that is an exercise in thinking differently about nature and our place in it, and particularly our place in urbanized nature. Most human beings of the 21st century will live in cities, and cities are where half of the world's greenhouse gases are generated. What is the relationship between cities and nature, and how can we achieve sustainable cities? To be sure, a few old cities, such as New York and San Francisco, and even a new one like I might mention Vancouver, that are built high and tight, are called good cities. They're a green metropolis. But few modern cities of 10 or more million actually fit this category. Moreover, most scholars producing theories about cities, what they are and what makes for good ones, have not paid a great deal of attention to sustainability. While many different disciplines have joined in the conversation, human geographers, social scientists, social psychology, economics, politics, as well as feminist and post-colonial studies, ecological and sustainability matters have been marginalized. We postmoderns are so focused on our social constructions, our interpretations and the products that we build, such as cities, that we forget what lies behind and beyond all our constructions, both mental and physical. And what lies behind it is nature, that encompassing and mysterious term for everything that is. Catherine Keller expresses the dilemma this way. She writes, she says, "Indeed, in the effort to expose the human social constructedness of the category nature, we do not yet have an adequate vocabulary for naming that reality that is us and is more than us, that's something in which we are embedded and which remains, however we reconstruct it, irreducible to us." End quote. Nature is not only irreducible to us, but it's also that upon which we rely every moment of our lives, for air, for water, for food, for habitat. One of the consequences of our increasing awareness of human control over nature, both in thought and in action, that is, in interpretation and physical construction, is the loss of a sense of our dependence on what is more than us. In our acknowledgement that there is no pristine nature, either in thought or reality, we have lost the sense that we are products of, sustained by, and totally dependent on nature, whatever we call it, and whatever it is. This forgetfulness is most evident in city dwellers, because cities are second nature. That is, what we have built from, transformed from, changed from first nature, this more than us, which is never reducible to our constructions. If the issues contained in the threat of climate change and its twin, unsustainable economics, are to be addressed, we must overcome this forgetfulness of first nature. We must, as the city dwellers that most of us now are, recall that nature is not just trees, parks, and flowers in our cities, but rather it is the foundation from which our cities are made. It is the material from which they are composed. Every sidewalk, condo, office building, sewer pipe, electric grid, shopping mall, concert hall, parking lot, car and bus, everything in a city is made from nature. We do not see this nature, which is the lifeblood of our cities, since much of it is hidden in these new transformations, the trillions of energy exchanges that take place for every school, hospital, and jail to be built. Energy is used not only for transportation and electricity when we drive our cars or light our houses and streets. Everything we do that involves a change of any sort involves an exchange of energy. Energy is nothing but first nature. I'll read that again. Everything we do that involves a change of any sort takes place through the exchange of energy. And energy is nothing but first nature. Therefore, we postmodern citizens of cities must acknowledge our situation. We are energy hogs in our use of first nature, even if we don't mean to be or if we're not aware of it most of the time. We must become aware of it. This is the challenge that cities, prime examples of second nature, pose to our time. As geographer and student of cities Edward Soja rightly points out, he says, human interpretation and manipulation do not erase nature. Rather, nature becomes a hybrid, as seen in urbanization. He writes, he says, the urban spatiality of nature, in essence, denaturalizes nature and charges it with social meaning. Raw physical nature may be naively or even divinely given to us to begin with, but once urban society comes into being, a new nature is created that blends into and absorbs what existed before. Then he says, this one sentence that I will be critiquing a little later, he says, one might say that the city replaces nature. The city replaces nature. End quote. Now, Soja's right, I think. He intends to undercut the conventional wisdom that views the natural and social worlds as separate. which he believes, and I agree, promotes dualism between nature and human beings. Rather, he suggests we should focus on the hybrid, that is, lived space, and especially in the city. By privileging space and place, everything changes, he says. We no longer indulge in binary dualisms of nature versus culture, but realize that at least since the beginning of agriculture, and hence of urbanization, nature has never been pristine. As he puts it, we have been without nature for 12,000 years, which means, for all intents and purposes, always without it. There is no untouched nature. There is no wilderness. Even Antarctica is urbanized. That is, it is socially and historically constructed. Highlighting space is a necessary corrective to the Western and Christian emphasis on time and history. This is not a point he makes, but I am making this point. It has, I think, several advantages moving from this focus that Christianity has had on time and history to space and place. First, it focuses our attention on the earth rather than heaven, and it does so by forcing us to attend to humanized spaces, that is, cities, where most of us human beings now live. It spotlights the need for habitat, for humanely built spaces, here and now, rather than eternal places in heaven by and by. Secondly, it helps us to see that natural disasters are never only natural. That is, it forces us to accept some responsibility for the effects of global warming as well as poverty. Third, it raises issues of power and privilege in a ways that a naive focus on first nature fails to do. For instance, who lives in the big house on the hill and who lives in the shack beside the railroad tracks? Fourth, I think, finally, it prohibits the romantic notion that all we need to do is to get back to nature, as if nature were pure, good, and available as our guide for life. So, this turn to space, especially urbanized space, suggests a revolution in Western thought, as well as timely attention to the space, that is, cities, where climate change and economic sustainability will meet their harshest test. This turn to space and place, focusing on the needs of billions of human bodies as well as trillions of other creatures, is a recognition that we are not robots or cyborgs, but bodies that need space. Christianity's traditional concern with time and history and its relative indifference to space and place carries Gnostic overtones. We need to be reminded of the following. To be human is to be placed. To be human is to be placed. As our planet becomes fuller with people and their increasing desire for high-energy lifestyles, space takes on new meaning. Everyone needs and wants more space as well as a place. Millions of displaced persons as well as cities of 12 to 15 million human beings are the shadow side of the recent and now defunct North American real estate boom's location, location, location. Space, place is about bodies and their most basic needs. Time and history can bracket out these lowly bodily needs in order to focus on things of the mind and the spirit, interpretation, meaning, and eternal salvation. So, I am very appreciative, as you can see, of this perspective. But we go on and ask, does this turn to space and place mean, as Soja puts it, that the city replaces nature? Soja speaks of a new nature that blends into and absorbs what existed before. And this, I think, is exactly what we must not accept. I fear that such language, while appreciative of the hybrid second nature of cities, allows for and, in fact, encourages us to forget first nature as the source of our being. Jane Jacobs said, "Without cities, we would be poor." And I would add, without nature, we would not exist. If we think of the city as absorbing or replacing nature, I fear that nature's intrinsic value as well as its finite limits will be hidden from our view. What then will deter our appetite for unlimited, voracious overutilization of other life forms and earth processes? What will control our greed the question that our ecological and economic crises are asking. While the city in many ways has replaced nature, both concretely as the habitat of most human beings and in our own constructions, nonetheless, the bottom line is that we are totally and minute to minute dependent on nature and its many services. Nature in the first sense, what Catherine called the all-encompassing source or ground of all that is, and more specifically, our own planet Earth, with its particular constitution of elements suitable for living things, is the sine qua non. No matter how much we transform first nature, as epitomized by the city and by our myriad interpretations, it is not infinitely malleable. The human ability to distance ourselves from first nature by changing it and by objectifying it is causing a deep forgetfulness to overtake us. I think this forgetfulness is very sharply epitomized in the city dweller's relationship to food. Our ability to distance ourselves from first nature is nowhere more evident than in our ignorance and denial of our total dependence on the earth with every mouthful we eat. Michael Pollan's fine book, tracing what he called the natural history of 4 meals back to their roots, he says, all flesh is grass. A wonderful take on the scriptural passage. It takes on new meaning, he says, when you consider that even a Twinkie or a Big Mac begins with a particular plant growing in a specific patch of soil somewhere on earth. Our flesh and the flesh that we eat can be traced back to the grass that feeds us. He says at either end of any food chain you find a biological system, a patch of soil, or a human body. The health of one is converted literally into the health of the other. All flesh is grass. And yet, we city dwellers have forgotten this all-important piece of information, the inexorable, undeniable link between our health and the health of the planet. The physicality of the connection needs to be underscored. It is from body to body. Pollan writes, he says, daily, our eating turns nature into culture, transforming the body of the world into our bodies and minds. It's impossible, I think, to make our absolute dependence on first nature any clearer. We need to relearn the importance of this most basic of all transformations. And Pollan says, for we would then no longer need any reminder that however we choose to feed ourselves, we eat by the grace of nature, not industry. And what we're eating is never anything more or less than the body of the world. Eating the body of the world. Food is the most basic example of our total dependence on how the earth works. And here are just a few very, very brief fundamental laws which are sobering and sometimes we forget. The first one, of course, is that all processes, both animate and inanimate, occur through energy exchanges. Energy is involved whenever work is done, when anything speeds up or slows down, is heated or cooled, moved, changes, and so on. The rules of how energy works are known as the famous first and second laws of thermodynamics, which you probably all know about. The first law is relatively benign. It says that while energy can be converted from one form to another, it is neither created nor destroyed. For example, fossil fuels can be converted into heat or electricity, converted into motion. Here only the form is changed, not the quantity. However, the second law presents the problem. For while the quantity remains the same, the quality decreases, tending to a randomness or disorder, what is called entropy. For example, fossil fuels cannot be recycled back into gas or coal, but are dissipated into the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. This is the bad news. The new form is not only less usable, but it can also be injurious, and this we see from global warming and greenhouse gases. So these laws govern the living and the non-living. Thus, as living things seem to increase in order, they always do so by a decrease somewhere else, that is, sucking orderliness from their environment. A good example is the high level of orderliness in cities versus the price paid for this comfort and complexity by nature. We end up clear-cutting forests, degrading arable land, lowering diversity in fisheries, draining water from aquifers, etc. City life is high-energy life. Billions, millions of transformations of energy must occur every hour for us North Americans to live as we wish to and have become accustomed to. With every energy exchange, from the ones moving our cars to those moving our electric toothbrushes. Who thought we had to have electric toothbrushes? But hey, everybody's got them now. A decrease occurs somewhere. Quality is lost. That is, something somewhere pays. There is no free lunch. Nature doesn't do bailouts. The second law says that we live on a finite planet and our energy sources are running out. In order for the world's population to live the comfortable, orderly lives that the top fifth of us enjoy, several more planets would be necessary. We are spending down the capital, so to speak, or in house rule language, if you keep raiding the fridge this way, there'll be nothing left to eat. But urban dwellers seldom see this. The city is the prime example of both our greatest accomplishment and our greatest danger. Jerusalem, the city of desire and delight, is fast becoming Babylon, the city of excessive luxury in the midst of extreme poverty. The city, which stands as the quintessential human habitation, civilized, diverse, cosmopolitan, is at the same time becoming the greatest threat to human well-being. As one critic puts it, of all recognized ecological systems, it is human urbanism which seems most destructive of its host. End quote. Cities suck energy from near and far in order to allow some city dwellers to live at the highest level of comfort and convenience ever known, while many other millions exist in squalor. Now, I'd underscore this does not mean that we should retreat to either the country or suburbia. For these spaces are even less energy efficient for millions of human habitats. The city is where most of us do live, will live, and where just sustainable living has the best chance. Nonetheless, city dwellers must attend to the judgment of the United Nations Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. It's the work of over 1,300 experts worldwide, which claims that we are excessive energy users. That is, we are literally consuming the planet. This massive study is the first attempt by the scientific community to describe and evaluate on a global scale the full range of services that people desire and have from nature. It's a sobering conclusion that out of 24 essential services provided by nature to humanity, nearly 2/3 are in decline. I was amazed the first time I heard about what I'm just going to share with you, this business of nature's service, free services. I didn't know it was this awesome. These services are numerous and all-encompassing, and they are given to us, as it were, free. Provisioning services such as food, fiber, genetic resources, biochemicals, natural medicines, and fresh water. Regulating services, air, climate, water, erosion, disease, pest, pollination, and natural hazard. Cultural services, spiritual and religious values, aesthetic values, recreation, and ecotourism. These are nature's services. We don't think about all this. All of this is this nature that is beyond us. This assessment stresses the need for consciousness raising. It says we must learn to recognize the true value of nature, both in an economic sense and in the richness it provides in our lives in ways more difficult than we can put numbers on. Such true value ranges from the taste of a cup of clean water to the sight of snow-capped mountains. We are nature's debtors and nature's lovers. Anthropologist David Harvey sums up the situation with these sobering words. He says, a strong case can be made that the humanly induced environmental transformations now underway are larger scale, riskier and more far-reaching and complex in their implications materially, spiritually, and aesthetically than ever before in human history. The quantitative shifts that have occurred in the last half of the 20th century imply a qualitative shift in environmental impacts and potential unintended consequences that requires a comparable qualitative shift in our responses and our thinking. And it's this last phrase that we're going to move to now. A comparable qualitative shift in our responses and our thinking differently. The task before us, a qualitative shift in our responses and thinking, is daunting. Yet such appears to be the overwhelming conclusion coming from all fields that study planetary health. As botanist and conservationist Peter Raven, for instance, says, it's also fundamentally a spiritual task. What I've realized in reading material in geography, anthropology, biology, sociology, all of which contribute to dealing with the planetary crisis, most scholars agree that an attitude change is also needed, a shift at a very deep level, a qualitative shift in our thinking. From the time of Aristotle to the 18th century, economics was considered a subdivision of ethics. The good life was understood to be based on such values as the common good, justice, and limits. Having lost this context for how to live on our planet and substituting the insatiable greed of market capitalism in its stead, we are now without the means to make the qualitative shift in thinking that is required. With the death of communism and the decline of socialism, Western society is left with an image of human life that is radically individualistic. This is diametrically opposed to how we should think of ourselves within an ecological worldview. It is impossible to imagine us acting differently, that is, acting as ecological citizens, unless we internalize ecological values. One of the distinctive activities of religion is the formation of basic assumptions regarding human nature and our place in the scheme of things. As theologians widely agree, all theology is anthropology. Religious traditions educate through stories, images, metaphors, creating in their adherents deep and often unconscious assumptions, or at the most semi-conscious assumptions, about who human beings are and how they should act. Religions are into the business of forming the imagination and thus influencing the action of people. It's at this point that the religions, I think, can make a significant contribution to the planetary crisis. Certainly not going to solve the problem, but maybe it's our little niche. It's our piece that we need to focus on. For we live within these assumptions. That is, we live within the constructions of who we think we are. As these assumptions, constructions change, so might our behavior. One small contribution toward this possibility is to change the metaphor by which we think of ourselves in the world. The metaphor that is conventional and widely accepted in 21st century market capitalism is of the individual in the machine. Human beings are seen as subjects in an objectified world which is there for our use, our needs, our desires, our recreation. The world is a thing to be utilized for human needs and pleasures. To see ourselves this way is, however, an anomaly in human history, for until the scientific revolution of the 17th century, as Carolyn Merchant and others have pointed out, the earth was assumed to be alive, even as we are. From the Stoics to the worldview of First Nations peoples, including medieval Christians, the apparent organic quality of the earth was never questioned. But during the last few hundred years, it has become increasingly useful and profitable to think of the world more like a machine than a body. Since we always think in metaphors, especially at the deepest level of our worldviews, the nature of the metaphor becomes critical. If the machine model is dominant, then we will think of the world's parts as only externally related, able to be repaired like cars with new parts, substituting for the faulty ones, with few consequences for the earth as a whole. With such a basic model in mind, it's hard for people to see the tragedy of clear-cut forest practices or the implications of global warming. The individual in the machine model fits easily into the sensibility of city dwellers, since most of us have a difficult time recognizing first nature as the source of our buildings, trucks, machines, and highways that we construct. Thinking of the world in terms of exchangeable parts is easy. Cities do not appear to be organic entities made from the earth. Rather, they appear to have independent parts made by human beings that can be torn down when needed and new ones put up. However, the body is re-emerging across many fields of study as a basic metaphor for interpretation and action. David Harvey mentions, he says, the extraordinary efflorescence of interest in the body as a grounding for all sorts of theoretical enterprises over the last 2 decades or so. End quote. As we have noted, this interest is hardly novel. From the Socratic notion of the body, or man, as the measure of all things, to the Stoic metaphor of the world as a living organism, and First Nations' understanding of the earth as mother of us all, body language has historically been central to the interpretation of our place in the scheme of things. And this is true of Christianity as well. As an incarnational religion, Christianity has focused on bodily metaphors. It's full of them. Jesus as the incarnate God, the Eucharist as the body and blood of Christ, the church as the body of Christ. To see bodily well-being as the measure of both human and planetary well-being is so obvious that it seems strange that it should need a revival. What is gradually surfacing once again is the realization that an appropriate metaphor with which to imagine our relation to the world is not as the individual in the machine, but bodies living within the body of the earth. And this is as true of city dwellers as it is of country folks. That is, city dwellers need to think differently, to think of their place, the city, as made from nature, from countless energy exchanges, all of which add greenhouse gases to the atmosphere. We've seen the results of living within the machine model for several hundred years, and we're, in fact, experiencing it very profoundly and personally, many of us personally and deeply, with the economic meltdown and climate change. The verdict is overwhelmingly negative. Is it time to return to the model of the world and ourselves as body? The body as measure, as the lens through which we view the world and ourselves, changes everything. It means that human beings as bodies, dependent on other bodies and on the body of the earth, are interrelated and interdependent in infinite, mind-boggling, wonderful, and risky ways. It means that materialism, in the sense of what makes for bodily well-being for all humans and for the earth, becomes the measure of the good life. So it combines the socialist or materialist and the ecological vision, the socialist and ecological vision of human and planetary flourishing. It means that the good life cannot be the hoarding by a few individuals of basic resources for their own comfort and enjoyment. Rather, if we desire to take care of ourselves, we must take care of the world, for we are, in this metaphor, internally related and mutually dependent on all parts of the body. The metaphor of the body, not just the human body, but all creaturely bodies, is a radically egalitarian measure of the good life. It claims that all bodies deserve the basics: food, habitat, clean air, and water, which is a revolutionary thought. So, moving on, I want to share some more specific comments now about the organic model, Christianity and the urban crisis. The Christian incarnational understanding of the God-world relationship, that the world is from the beginning loved by God and is a reflection of the divine, means that flesh, body, space, and place, air, water, food, and habitat, these become, in my estimation, religious matters. The locus of attention of incarnational Christianity is the body, both the world as body and the bodies that compose it. The material focus becomes central. Incarnational theology is militantly anti-Gnostic. It is anti-spiritualizing and anti-dualistic. The Christian incarnational focus on bodies can be seen in two central historical streams in Christianity, the sacramental and the prophetic, or the Catholic and the Protestant. The sacramental dimension says that the world is a reflection of God, tells us of God, and connects the earthly, bodily joys of life, beauty, love, food, music, play, with God. The prophetic dimension insists that since the world is a body, it must be fed and cared for. All parts receive their just supply of resources, and it must be sustained for the indefinite future. While the sacramental dimension of the model encourages us to appreciate and love others, that is, realize their worth, the prophetic dimension focuses our attention on limits. The recognition that bodies, including the body of the world, are finite. All life forms must have food, fresh water, clean air, and a habitat. The prophetic dimension stresses the limits of all bodies, the finitude of the planet, and the need for just and sustainable resources. So, is the organic model relevant to the upcoming urban crisis? I think the prophetic dimension of the model especially is the one that I want to focus on. That is, the awareness of finitude, limits, and the needs of bodies. I think it suggests a dimension that must take center stage. Our survival, our very survival, may well rest on living within such a construction of nature. That is, one in which second nature is constrained. The prophetic dimension of the organic model, which sees all bodies as needing the basics, suggests an ethic of self-limitation for 21st century well-off urban dwellers, so that the projected slum dwellers may have some space and place, as well as other life forms have habitation. An ethic of self-limitation could also address the issue of climate change due to excessive urban energy use. I'm going to switch gears here for a minute. Last year, I taught a course on spiritual autobiography. And I've taught this course many times. In fact, it was the first course that I taught 40 years ago. I'm still teaching it in different forms. It's about folks like Teresa of Avila and John Woolman, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Simone Weil, Mohandas Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., Nelson Mandela, Dorothy Day. People who live lives of extraordinary love for others, especially the weak and the vulnerable. I always find new insights teaching the course, and last year was no exception. I was struck by a characteristic shared by many of them, the rather shocking practice of self-emptying, of what the Christian tradition calls kenosis. The text from Philippians sums it up. Let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself, taking the form of a slave, being born in human likeness. And being found in human form, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. That's Philippians 2, 5-8. What an inversion this is of triumphal imperialistic views of Christianity. The reason I'm struck by self-emptying, this self-emptying, is because I believe it might suggest an ethic for our time. A time that is characterized by climate change and financial chaos. These two crises are the result of excess, our insatiable appetites that are literally consuming the world. We are debtors twice over, financially and ecologically. The very habits that are causing the financial crisis are also destroying the planet. We are living way beyond our means at all levels. Our personal credit cards, the practices of the financial lending institutions, and the planet's resources that support us all. Could this crazy notion of self-emptying, a notion that is found in different forms in many religious traditions, be a clue to what is wrong with our way of being in the world, as well as a suggestion of how we might live differently? Whether in Buddhism's release from desire by non-attachment, or Christianity's admonition that to find one's life one must lose it. Religions are often countercultural in their various ethics of self-denial in order that genuine fulfillment might occur. While in some religious traditions such self-denial moves into asceticism and life denial, this is not usually the underlying assumption. I'm thinking of someone like John Woolman, an 18th century American Quaker, who had a successful retail business and gave it up because he felt it kept him from seeing clearly something that disturbed him, and that was slavery. He was one of the first abolitionists. He came to see how money stood in the way of clear perception of injustice. People who had a lot of property and land needed slaves to maintain them, so these folks reasoned. He saw the same problem with his own reasoning. They said his eye was not single because whenever he looked at injustice in the world, he always saw it through his own eye. It's as if he had double vision. He couldn't really see the situation. It was always through his own bias. If he was able to move himself out of the center, then, he said, his eye became single. Once he reduced his level of prosperity, he could see the clear links between riches and oppression. He wrote, "Every degree of luxury has some connection with evil." Reduction of his lifestyle gave him an insight into the difference between needs and wants, something that our insatiable consumer culture is almost finds impossible to recognize. As an ethic at a time of climate change, Woolman suggests the clarity of perception into others' needs that can come about through the reduction of one's own wants. Now, interestingly, Woolman did not find that such self-emptying was negative or depressing. Rather, he found it fulfilling. He has a dream in which he hears the words, "John Woolman is dead." And he realizes now that his own will is dead, and he can say with Paul that he is crucified with Christ. That is, that Christ might live in him. He says we find ourselves by losing ourselves. That deeper desire is the desire for God, for nothing less can fill the hunger in us. As Augustine pointed out many years ago, he said that we are drawn to God as a sheep is drawn to a leafy branch or a child to a handful of nuts. To empty the self is not an act of denial, but of fulfillment because it creates space for God to fill one's being. We are satisfied by nothing less than God. Our deepest desire is to be one with God. Made in the image of God, our destiny is to become one with God so that we too can say, "Not my will, but yours be done." This is not a loss, but a gain for these people, the greatest gain. What we see here is not an ascetic call for self-denial to purify ourselves or even a moral injunction to give space to others. Rather, it's more basic. It's an invitation to imitate the way God loves the world. In the Christian tradition, kenosis, or self-emptying, is a way to understand God's actions in creation, in the Incarnation, in the cross, and in discipleship. In creation, God limits the divine self, pulling in, so to speak, to allow space for others to exist. God, who is the one in whom we live and move and have our being, does not take up all the space, but gives space and life to others. This is an inversion of the usual understanding of power as control. Instead, power is given to others to live as diverse and valuable creatures. Kenosis is understood in the Incarnation. I mentioned Paul's Philippians 2:7. God emptied the divine self, taking the form of a slave, substituting humility and vulnerability for our insatiable appetites. In the cross, God gives of the divine self without limit to side with the poor and the oppressed. God does not take the way of the victor, but like Jesus and the temptations, rejects absolute power and imperialism for a different way. And therefore, Christian discipleship becomes a form of cruciform life, imitating the self-giving of Christ for others. Another example of kenotic living is the case of the French philosopher and unbaptized Catholic Simone Weil. She lived a radical and brief life of solidarity with her poorest and often starving fellow citizens during the Second World War. She practiced what she called decreation, a form of self-emptying in which she sees herself diminish as God grows within her. Decreation, or the death of the will, is giving up control over one's life so that God can subvert the self's exorbitant and constantly growing desires. The point is not mortification, but a discipline of emptying herself so that God could be all in all. She said, to eat when one wants and what one wants when others is starving is a symbol of control over finitude. It's a symbol of exceptionalism, which she refused to embrace. Food is a symbol of the basic physical limits, and unless we can limit our own voracious appetites, we will not be able to attend to the hunger in others, she said, their abject suffering, whether it's physical or emotional. Our tendency, she said, is to love others because of our needs, not theirs, our hunger, not their hunger. Our fat, relentless egos want more, more, more. The insatiability of the consumer culture, which has resulted in climate change and more recently in financial disaster. Simone Weil says that human beings are naturally cannibalistic. Not a very attractive comment on us. We eat instead of looking. We devour instead of paying attention. We consume other people and the planet in our search for self-fulfillment. Augustine claimed something similar with his understanding of sin. Sin is voracious, lustful desire to have it all for oneself. From the 21st century ecological perspective, sin is refusing to share, refusing to live in such a way that other people and other life forms can also live. For us in our time, sin is refusing to live justly and sustainably with all others on our planet. It's refusing to share the banquet of life. As with woman, the problem, as Simone Weil understands it, is the inability to really see others, to pay attention to their needs rather than simply our wants. The United Nations Earth Charter, a document which lays out the principles for a just, sustainable planet, agrees. Its first principle reads, recognize that all beings are interdependent and every form of life has value regardless of its worth to human beings. Astounding statement. An ethic of self-emptying begins with the recognition that something beside oneself really exists and needs the basics of existence. Paying attention to others, looking, not eating, is a somber, I think, thoughtful ethic in a time of climate change and economic meltdown. Put simply, climate change is the result of too many human beings using too much energy and taking up too much space on the planet. Environmentalism is not simply about maintaining green spaces in cities or national parks. Rather, it is, as I have been trying to suggest, it's the more basic issue of energy use on a finite planet. Thus, space and energy, the basic physical needs of all creatures, a place to live, and the energy to sustain life day by day, this is the issue. In other words, the crisis facing us is one of geography, one of space and place and habitation. It's not basically about time and history and human meaning. Rather, it is physical, earthly, worldly, and fleshly, the basics of existence. Now, this is a strange crisis to face. It doesn't have the immediacy of a war or a plague or a tsunami. I mean, if only it did, we might be able to wake up. Rather, it has to do with how we live on a daily basis, the food we eat, the transportation we use, the size of the house we live in, the consumer goods we buy, the luxuries we allow ourselves, and for a lot of us, the amount of long-distance air travel that we permit ourselves, which is a really difficult one. When I moved from Nashville to Vancouver, leaving my children and grandchildren in Nashville, I didn't think that I would have any problem. If I had enough money, I could simply go down to Nashville whenever I felt like it. I realize now it's not that simple. Air travel is an enormous ecological footprint. If we were doing it justly across the whole planet and everybody had the same ecological footprint allocation, then taking a trip from New York to Paris and back would take up your whole fuel allowance for the whole year, for everything. That would wipe you out. Well, how often we do this? I travel to environmental conferences. So it's not easy. We are not being called to take up arms and fight an enemy. Rather, the enemy is the very ordinary lives that we ourselves are leading as North Americans. And yet, for all its presumed innocence, this way of life, multiplied by billions of people, is both unjust to those who cannot attain this lifestyle, and it's destructive of the very planet that supports us. A very different form of life is suggested by another extraordinary Christian who was part of my spiritual autobiography class, Dorothy Day, who identified totally with the abject poverty of people living in the ghettos of New York City during the Great Depression. She lived a life of joyful sharing, a form of abundant life totally contrary to our consumer understanding. If Woolman and Simone Weil belong to the prophetic strain in Christianity, the strain that underscores the way to God through self-emptying, Day belongs, I think, to the sacramental path that, while acknowledging the importance of self-emptying, revels in the fulfillment that follows. She found the abundant life in voluntary poverty. She did indeed find her life by losing it, but it was a rich, full, joyful life. In her wonderful autobiography, The Lone Loneliness, if you haven't read it, she writes at the end of the very last, she says, "We were just sitting there talking when lines of people began to form, saying, 'We need bread.' We could not say, 'Go thou, be thou filled.' If there were 6 small loaves and a few fishes, we had to divide them. There was always bread. There was always room for one more. Each of us would simply have a little less. We cannot love God unless we love each other, and to love we must know each other. We know God in the baking of bread, and we know each other in the breaking of bread, and we are not alone anymore. Heaven is a banquet, and life is a banquet, even with a crust where there is companionship. A very, very joyful life." The kenotic paradigm in Woolman, Weil, and Day is not for the sake of asceticism or self-flagellation. It's not a negative statement about the earth and life. Rather, it's the recognition that life's flourishing on earth demands certain limitations and sacrifices at physical and emotional levels. What characterizes our time is 2 things. First, an awareness of our radical interdependence on all other life forms, and second, an increasing appreciation of the planet's finitude and vulnerability. These realities of our time, I think, mean that a vocabulary and sensibility of self-limitation, egolessness, sharing, giving space to other, limiting our energies use, this is no longer simply special language for the saints, which we'd like to think it is. They can do it. We don't have to. But rather an ethic for all of us. It might be that the religions are the greatest realists in their intuitive appreciation for self-emptying and self-limitation as a way not only to personal fulfillment, but also to sane planetary practice. Could it be that the religions might take the lead in exploring and illustrating how an ethic of self-limitation might function in light of the 21st century's crisis of climate change? The banquet of which Dorothy Day speaks, the banquet of heaven and the banquet of earth, is an inclusive feast. As she writes of it, there is always room for one more, but each of us will have a little less. So what does this have to do with cities? To be winding up here. Recent UN projections on the growth of cities claim that slum living is now among the fastest legacies of so-called civilization. Given present trends, 1 out of 3 city dwellers will be doomed to the slums. The conditions in many cities, those pushing 15 million, are already dire. The needs of the doubling of city populations by mid-century from the present 2 billion to 4 billion are simply mind-boggling. Housing, public health, transportation, energy, food and water, education, medical services are simply the basics for minimal human existence. For us well-off city dwellers, the kenotic prophetic sensibility means, I think, some concrete, empirical, on-the-ground changes. It means that second nature, the built environment, must be minimalized rather than maximalized. It means small condos, not monster mansions. It means living spaces that go up, not out. It means small hybrid cars, not Hummers. Food that is grown locally, not halfway down the world. It means being able to say no, to say enough. Second nature is built upon first nature, and first nature is increasingly a vulnerable, deteriorating body unable to support the Western high-energy lifestyle. This realization should impact us at all levels: what we eat, our means of transportation, what we wear, the places we live, the parks where we play, the offices where we work, and the way that we vote, needless to say. One of the greatest challenges of the 21st century is decent livable conditions for the billions that live in cities. We well-off city dwellers need to take up less space, use less energy, lower our desires, and attend to needs rather than wants. The prophetic kenotic sensibility demands that prosperous urban dwellers retreat from expansion and accept simplification at all levels of existence. We need to imagine living within a bounded economy, that is, living with restraint on our finite planet. The prophetic kenotic sensibility is not just for individuals, it is a characteristic of our planet. In a recent issue of the journal Nature, scientists named 9 key planetary boundaries that must be respected in order to avoid catastrophic environmental disaster. 3 of these boundaries, climate change, biological diversity, and nitrogen and phosphorus inputs into the biosphere and oceans, have already been breached through human activity. The planet has limits. It demands that we live within limits. So in conclusion, second nature needs to acknowledge the base on which it is built and will continue to depend. That is first nature. Totalizing theories that eliminate first nature forget that we are bodies before all else. We cannot interpret or build unless we can eat. It's that basic. We cannot interpret or build unless we can eat. While we are also, and at the same time, interpreters and builders of our world, we are not its maker or its master. There is something outside of all of our interpretations and our constructions. The air we must breathe, the water we must drink, the food we must eat. An understanding of second nature that underestimates the inescapable importance of first nature is not only unhelpful in our planetary crisis, it is also false. It does not help us to live as best we can, making decisions that are relatively better even if Eden, that is, pristine first nature, is no longer available. An organic model of the world reminds us of the sacredness, beauty, and importance of first nature at both the local and planetary level. It reminds us also that our planet is a limited physical entity able to support millions of species as well as human beings, but only on a just and sustainable basis. The kenotic God who opened up space for creation, who became empty in the Incarnation, is far removed from the image of an absolute unmoved ruler who controls others by demanding total obedience. The power of the kenotic God lies in giving space for others, dying to the self that others might live. This strange reversal, losing one's life to save it, is also the sensibility that is needed if our planet is to survive and prosper. Giving space, I've suggested, is a basic Christian doctrine, but it is also deep in the center of most religions, and it is felt in the hearts of all people, religious or not, who know that that love is the discovery of reality. That is, the realization that something beside yourself really exists. Other bodies exist and must be fed and cared for. Once that acknowledgement is internalized, there's no going back to the assumption that individuals can pursue their own good apart from the good of others. The organic model of the world is a fit one for 21st century urban life. It suggests a context, a way of thinking, a construction within which to live that underscores the beauty and intrinsic value of what is left of first nature, as well as our inexorable dependence on it. It helps to situate human beings in an appropriate stance toward the world, a stance of gratitude and care. Gratitude for the wonder of living on this beautiful planet. As Rilke puts it, being here is magnificent. And care for its fragile, deteriorating creatures and systems. We do not own the earth. We do not even pay rent for it. It is given to us free for our lifetime, with the proviso that we treat it with the honor it deserves, appreciating it as a reflection of the divine and loving it as our mother and our neighbor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sallie. We will now have a response by Professor David Lamberth, and then we'll open up for Q&A.
Let me begin by thanking Professor McFague for a stimulating and thought-provoking lecture. This lecture not only marks a new direction in the exceptionally long history of Dudleyan lectures at Harvard, it also contributes importantly to our broader thinking in the ongoing series on ecologies of human flourishing, specifically focused as we are this year on spiritual moral principles in relation to a world in crisis. The focus on cities that she offers as an orienting problematic for theological reflection is particularly important. This is so not only because this year the world crossed a threshold of having half its total population living in cities. It depends on which our data sort of differs here. It's where you have the dividing line. But also because, as McFague herself adverts at one point, ecologists are largely agreed that whatever their limitations, cities not only are more efficient habitations for human beings from the energy standpoint, but they also have much greater possibilities for increased efficiency in living and flourishing than do spatially dispersed environments. Professor McFague offers a rich and complicated analysis in this lecture, noting not only the centrality of cities and the problematic within them of obfuscating their and our dependence on what she calls first nature. In addition, she connects the contributing causes of the climate crisis and the recent economic crisis by noting a common ethical underpinning in an ethic of insatiable desire, development, and growth. Her theological reflections are equally comprehensive in scope, bringing into relief Christianity's tendency to focus on time and history over space and place, and the modern predominance of a mechanical model of understanding the individual, suggesting a complicity of this long tradition of reflection and self-understanding in the emergence of current and modern problematics, particularly within Western typical cities. McFague's prescriptions are also significant, modeling the need to give space, to check desire and self-interest, and crucially, emphasizing the need to move from a mechanical model of selves to an organic understanding of the interrelatedness of individuals within cities and the environments and broader nature that subtend and make those lives possible. Turning to the Christian tradition for a key ethical model, Professor McFague takes the lives of extraordinary individuals as a touchstone, underwriting the importance not only of the limit-attending aspects of the prophetic, but also more centrally the space and place-giving model of kenotic or self-emptying practice, typified by Christ, but underlined in figures such as Simone Weil. An incarnational sense focused on the embodied and organic nature of us and the world, but ethically oriented to the other, is, McFague suggests, an ethic which might be able to help us navigate the current crisis. I find all of this extremely productive and appealing, and I appreciate very much the deep reflection presented here. I nonetheless, as a respondent, have the job of having a couple of concerns, and hence I do. And notably in this case, they're focused on whether, given the scope of the current crisis, the analysis and ethic as presented can practically be sufficient to orient us towards the sort of changes that are required in the very near future, as we try to reverse our travel beyond the sustainable carbon threshold toward the dreaded tipping point of no return. I heard Bill McKibben last week talking about the level of parts per million we've reached now, which is in the 390s, where 350 is the sustainable level. With a view to our discussions coming after this, I will simply pose rather than fully organize several of my questions and concerns and then listen to the conversation. First, I'm unsure that we do well to identify closely the recent economic crisis with the far more serious and enduring issue of climate change. While both no doubt have to do with the desire for more, and certainly in the developed West, the fundamental problem of climate change is driven less by unbridled greed and more fundamentally by the fact that we have structured society's developments to date around carbon-based energy sources. The many advances that modernity, for example, has brought, such as medical developments and improvements in the basic quality of life, extensions of life expectancy, are not themselves features of greed, much less morally problematic except in terms of their wildly inequitable distribution. Were we to have aligned technology with a fundamentally renewable energy source at some point within the last 250 years, the climate problem just would not be what it is. We certainly need to consume less, but even the basic needs of 6.7 billion people can only be sustained for the long term by turning away from carbon-oriented technology, not merely limiting our desires severely. Severe limitation is not enough. This is the underlying imperative, more fundamental than the urban-rural split or the particular way our cities are built, although both of these are subordinately important. Secondly, although I find both interesting and inspiring the prophetic and canonic ethics of Jesus and Vey and Woolman, I'm concerned that such ethics of extraordinariness may not be able to move us where we need to go. Max Weber, in his analysis of charisma and the figure of the prophet, notes the extraordinary quality of individuals who occupy these roles. And I dare say the same is true of these inspiring biographies which McFague cites. But is widespread, much less comprehensive imitation of these actually possible? History teaches us that it may well not be. I suspect that what is needed is a different ethic of the ordinary, one not too far out of reach of the relatively normal person. Vey's approach to eating, for example, cannot and should not be generalized. Adequate nourishment is key to anyone who does physical labor, such as those who grow our food and make our cities and our lives work, not to mention the malnourished. The exceptional and even elite model here strikes me as impractical, however inspiring it is. And this may well be a problem in general with imitation models as an approach when oriented, as they so often are, towards charismatic and exceptional individuals. McFague is certainly right that we need a serious reorientation towards one another, towards our shared and communal interest, and among we humans and the earth. And for other reasons, we need it to be more egalitarian and more democratic. I'm inclined to think that, however interesting kenosis is, a more fundamental Christian contribution to ethics, which has comparative analogs in Buddhism and Islam and other religious traditions, is the fundamental religious orientation so frequently found to the community, and the idea that the individual's true interest is only found when it's located in the context of our collective interest. Now, this is signified in Christianity initially through the outpouring of the Spirit onto the community in Acts, though so frequently these days the Pentecost is not read in that fashion. In the hands of modern thinkers like Josiah Royce and Martin Luther King, this is advanced through talk of building the beloved community in the here and now rather than the later and deferred. My point is not that this ethical theme is more concrete than kenosis, or even more radical, for it's not. Rather, it is more fundamentally oriented towards the collective shift which Professor McFague argues so strongly that we need, and, more importantly, something to which individuals could see their own everyday actions contributing to. As much as we like to think that change comes through radical realignments of thought, history and psychology more often than not indicate that incremental changes at the level of as many ordinary individuals' practice as possible is instead crucial. With a problem so large and immediate as that of current global climate, and the challenge of making livable and equitable cities within that, we can only pray that such religious revaluations in as many places as possible can combine with other social and political efforts to push us towards an ethical tipping point in terms of our own habits and our ordinary practices that follow on them. Life itself on the planet does not depend on this. I recall quite well Stephen Jay Gould giving the Ingersoll lecture on immortality from this podium, pointing out that the height of biodiversity from the standpoint of evolution was 10,000 years ago at the time of the flourishing of the creatures that are found in the Burgess Shale near Vancouver. Life on the planet does not depend on this. Life will go on in a carbon cycle that does not support us. Human life, as we know it, does. There's a great deal more to talk about, but my time, at least, is past, and I will hold the rest of my questions and look forward to our conversation. Thank you so much.